The Texas sun blazed down on the barren road, its fiery heat pushing the air to shimmer in waves. The landscape was dry, dust settling in the creases of the cracked earth, as the distant sounds of cicadas buzzed in the oppressive silence. A lone figure walked across the open field, a man hunched over, dragging his feet through the dirt. His face was worn, lined with age and hardship, his skin a map of years spent under the unforgiving sun. Connor Slate, the old man, was making his way to the tree. His steps were slow, but his purpose was clear. He carried 3 leashes, and on the end of each one was a puppy, weak and frail, their tiny bodies trembling with fear. Connor's hands trembled too, but not out of kindness. His fingers gripped the ropes tight, yanking the puppies forward. They whined in protest, their bodies so small and fragile that each step seemed like a struggle. With a grunt, Connor reached the tree, a solitary, gnarled thing that seemed to stand as a symbol of hopelessness. There, he tied the puppies to the base, their bodies still trembling under the scorching heat. He stepped back, surveying them with cold eyes. "You're better off here, you worthless things," he muttered, turning away without a second glance. The puppies struggled, their cries breaking the silence, but Connor was long gone, leaving them to their fate. As the sun continued its relentless descent, a truck rumbled down the dusty road. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes had just returned home from his 3rd deployment. He was no stranger to the weight of battle, the scars it left both on his body and in his mind. He was a man changed, worn down by war and haunted by memories he couldn't outrun. His truck bounced over the uneven road, its tires kicking up dust behind him. The sound of the engine was the only thing that filled the silence until something caught his attention. The faint sound of whimpering. He slowed the truck, his eyes scanning the horizon. There, by the tree, were the puppies, 3 small shapes tied to the trunk. His heart clenched as he saw their helplessness. They were too weak to struggle, their tiny bodies pressed against the rough bark, their fur matted and their eyes glazed with fear. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. His instincts flared. He couldn't just drive by. Not today. Not after everything he had been through. He parked the truck, the engine sputtering to a stop. "Damn it," Daniel muttered to himself. He didn't want to get involved. His own soul was scarred enough. But the puppies' cries echoed in his ears, louder than the war memories he tried to bury. He grabbed his keys and slammed the door, walking toward the tree with steady determination. As Daniel approached, the puppy's eyes met his, full of terror and confusion. Their whines were weak, but they looked to him as if he were their last hope. Daniel crouched down, his breath shallow. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against one of the puppy's trembling bodies. It flinched at his touch, but the whimpering grew quieter, as if the animal understood he was there to help. "Hey, little one," Daniel murmured softly. He could feel his heart breaking at the sight of them. These weren't just any puppies, they were K9 German shepherds. Their bodies were trained to endure, to serve in law enforcement or the military. These puppies were bred for something greater than this. "What the hell happened to you?" Daniel whispered, his voice breaking with disbelief. He pulled out his knife and quickly sliced through the ropes. The puppy he freed immediately collapsed in his arms, too weak to stand. He gathered the 3 puppies carefully, one by one, and placed them in the back of his truck. Their fur was dirty and matted, their eyes dull with exhaustion. But at least they were no longer tied to the tree, left to die under the brutal sun. As he started the engine, the puppies settled down in the back, their small bodies curling together for warmth and comfort. Daniel drove slowly, the weight of the moment heavy on his chest. He couldn't shake the image of the old man walking away without a second glance. The cruelty. It made his blood boil. The truck rumbled along the dirt road, and Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror. The puppies were still. But something gnawed at him. These weren't ordinary dogs. No, these puppies were meant for something bigger. Something military. He could tell by the way Axel, the largest of the 3, had looked at him with such intensity. The way he had sat up immediately, as if trained to respond. Back at his modest home, Daniel set up a small space for the puppies. They were exhausted, but the least he could do was offer them shelter and care. He couldn't just throw them out. Not after what he'd seen. As he opened a can of food and fed the puppies, Axel, his dark brown eyes piercing, watched him intently. "Axel," Daniel said softly, his voice hoarse. "You're something special, aren't you?" The puppy tilted his head as if understanding. Daniel chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. He was used to the solitude, but this was different. These puppies had a purpose. And he had a feeling their purpose was now intertwined with his. Later that evening, after a long day of tending to the puppies, Daniel sat on his porch, his feet propped up, sipping a cold beer. The Texas night was cool, but his mind was anything but. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Those puppies hadn't just been abandoned, they had been discarded. And someone would come looking for them. Suddenly, a noise broke his thoughts. A rustling in the bushes. Daniel stood, his instincts kicking in. He moved quietly, staying low to the ground, as a dark figure emerged from the shadows. A man in black clothing, his face hidden under a cap. "Hey! What do you want?" Daniel shouted, stepping into the man's path. The man froze, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just looking for something," the stranger said, his voice cold and distant. "Those puppies, you shouldn't have them." Daniel took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and vanished into the night. As Daniel stood there, his heart racing, the cold fear settled in. This wasn't over. Whatever the hell was going on with those puppies, it was only just beginning. The days passed, but the unease gnawing at Daniel only grew stronger. Despite the comforting sight of the puppies growing stronger each day, a sense of foreboding loomed over him. There was something about Axel, the way he held himself, his sharp focus, that spoke of a past he couldn't yet understand. The other two pups, Max and Bella, were sweet and affectionate, but Axel had an intensity that didn't sit well with Daniel. He couldn't help but think about that man who had appeared in the shadows. He had seemed out of place, like a predator lurking at the edges of Daniel's quiet life. The whole situation was strange. Who were these puppies really? Why had they been abandoned? And who were the men that seemed to be searching for them? Late one evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, papers scattered around him. He had been researching the dogs for hours. His military training told him that Axel's behavior was unlike that of a typical puppy. His obedience, his almost eerie focus, were signs of K9 training, a breed of dog designed for service, often used in military or police work. But how did these puppies end up abandoned in the middle of nowhere? Daniel's eyes narrowed as he came across a name, Connor Slate. A breeder, or rather, a trainer of elite K9 German Shepherds. Slate's name was tied to several K9 operations, particularly for military and law enforcement. As Daniel dug deeper, a dark reality began to form. Slate had been known for his involvement with illegal operations. There were whispers, rumors about how he bred dogs for nefarious purposes, selling them to the highest bidder. Some said he was part of an underground K9 training program that operated outside the law. Daniel's stomach churned with the realization. These puppies were bred for something dangerous, something dark. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a new sense of purpose. He couldn't let it go. Something about these puppies felt like a puzzle, and he was determined to piece it together. Axel's behavior was no longer just strange, it was a clue. As he prepared to head out to the nearby town for supplies, Daniel thought of the man from the night before. The way he had disappeared into the night, so deliberately, so effortlessly, was something that didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At the local library, Daniel pored over old articles and documents about Connor Slate. He learned that Slate had operated under several aliases, moving from town to town as his dealings became more and more illegal. There were reports of missing dogs, suspicious transactions, and a pattern of secrecy. The puppies, Axel especially, must have been part of his twisted business. Daniel felt a growing sense of anger. These puppies weren't just abandoned, they were discarded like property, tools that no longer had value to their owner. That evening, Daniel returned home, his head swimming with questions. He barely had time to process what he had discovered when he heard a noise outside. Axel was at the door, barking furiously. The hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stood up. He stepped toward the door cautiously, but Axel's barking grew more insistent, frantic even. As he opened it, the scent of danger filled the air. A man was standing at the edge of the property, his face hidden in the shadows. His posture was rigid, threatening. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," the man called out in a low voice. Daniel's heart raced. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. The man stepped forward, revealing a scar running down his cheek. "I'm not the one you want to mess with," he growled. "Those puppies were bred for a reason. And now, they're in the wrong hands." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just some random threat, it was personal. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I'm not giving them up," Daniel said firmly, stepping out into the night. His voice was calm, but his fists clenched, ready for whatever came next. The man's eyes flickered briefly toward Axel, who was growling with increasing intensity. "You don't know what you're getting into," the man warned. "They're not just dogs. They're weapons." Before Daniel could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel stood there, his breath heavy, his mind spinning. Weapons? The puppies were part of something much bigger than he had imagined. Axel's eyes met Daniel's, filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. It was as if Axel knew that this was just the beginning. Daniel rushed back into the house, locking the door behind him. He was no stranger to danger, but this was different. These puppies, Axel especially, were no ordinary animals. They had been bred for a purpose. And now, that purpose was dragging Daniel deeper into a world he had no interest in. The next day, Daniel called Sheriff Boone. Boone had been a friend of his late father, and although Boone had always been a lawman by the book, Daniel had a hunch that the sheriff might know more about Slate than he let on. "Sheriff, I need your help," Daniel said when Boone answered. "There's something going on with these puppies. I think they're part of something big, something illegal." Boone's voice was quiet on the other end. "What kind of something?" "Something dangerous," Daniel replied, his voice laced with urgency. "I think they were bred for military or police work. But now they're being hunted." Boone was silent for a long moment before responding. "I'll be there in an hour." As Daniel ended the call, Axel nudged his hand with his nose, his eyes full of a silent understanding. It was as though Axel knew the danger they were facing, he could sense it, too. Daniel took a deep breath. He didn't know how far this would go, but one thing was clear, Axel and the other puppies weren't just innocent creatures. They were pawns in a much bigger game, and Daniel was now tangled in it. The following days passed in a blur for Daniel. The feeling of being watched never quite left him, and every passing car or unfamiliar figure felt like a threat. Axel's quiet growl whenever someone approached the house confirmed his suspicions, something dangerous was lurking just beyond his door. Yet, with each passing day, Daniel's bond with the puppies, especially Axel, grew stronger. Sheriff Boone arrived at Daniel's home the following afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. His truck crept slowly up the gravel driveway, and Daniel met him at the door. "You said you had something for me, Daniel," Boone said, eyeing him with curiosity, but also wariness. He was a man who believed in order and law, and this situation didn't sit well with him. Boone had seen enough in his years as a sheriff to know when something was off, and this felt very much like it. "I need your help," Daniel began, leading Boone to the small backyard where the puppies were resting. Axel, as always, was the first to rise, his ears perked at the sight of the sheriff. "I've been looking into these dogs, especially Axel, and I think I've uncovered something bigger than I can handle on my own." Boone followed Daniel's gaze, locking eyes with the dog. There was something unsettling about the way Axel watched him, intelligent, calculating. "What kind of something?" Boone asked again, his voice now tinged with a concern that wasn't there before. "I think they were bred for military use," Daniel said, his voice low. "These puppies, they're not just for law enforcement. They're part of a secret K-9 training program that's been operating on the fringes of the law. They've been sold, trafficked, used in ways no dog should ever be used." Boone squinted, processing the information. "And who's behind this? A rogue breeder?" Daniel nodded. "His name's Connor Slate. He's been operating for years, selling trained dogs to shady organizations, military contractors, private mercenaries, anyone who can pay. There are whispers about how his breeding operations have ties to human trafficking and illegal arms deals." Boone's face darkened. "Sounds like something I should have known about long ago." He turned his gaze back to Axel. "These dogs have seen more than we can even imagine." Just then, a noise from across the yard broke their conversation. Axel was suddenly alert, his body rigid. His head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He knew that look. "You hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice tense. Boone nodded, reaching for his holster. The two men moved cautiously toward the fence, where Axel stood frozen. They both scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. Without warning, a black SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. It was moving slowly, deliberately, too deliberately. "That's them," Daniel murmured under his breath. "They've found me." Boone stepped forward, drawing his weapon and motioning for Daniel to stay back. "Stay low. Let me handle this," he said, but Daniel wasn't about to sit idly by. "I'm not letting them take Axel," Daniel said firmly. "These men are after more than just the puppies, they're after everything we've discovered." The SUV parked just outside the gate, and two men stepped out, both dressed in black tactical gear. They were the same type of men Daniel had seen before, silent, methodical, like ghosts. One of the men, taller and more muscular, approached the fence, his eyes narrowing as he saw Daniel standing there. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," the man said coldly. Daniel didn't flinch. "I don't know who you are, but you won't touch Axel." The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "We don't have time for this. Get out of the way." Before Daniel could react, Axel lunged forward, his growl deep and low, a primal sound that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. The puppy, now almost fully grown, was standing between Daniel and the men, his body poised and ready to attack. His training had kicked in, he was protecting Daniel, his new partner, just as he had been trained to protect a soldier or an officer. The man raised his hand, signaling for his companion to advance, but Axel was too quick. He lunged at the man with lightning speed, knocking him off balance. Daniel could see the surprise in the men's eyes as they scrambled to regain control. "Stop him," the first man shouted, but it was too late. Axel, with precision and discipline, had already driven the man to the ground, pinning him down with the strength of a trained K-9. Boone had moved quickly, his gun drawn, but Daniel held out his hand, signaling for him to hold off. He didn't want to escalate the situation. "Not yet. You don't know who you're dealing with," the man gasped from the ground, trying to free himself from Axel's grip. Daniel leaned down, his voice low and unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're from Slate's operation, aren't you?" The man's face twisted in anger, but he didn't respond. His silence confirmed everything Daniel needed to know. The second man, realizing his partner was down, reached into his coat, pulling out a gun. Boone immediately stepped in front of Daniel, aiming his weapon at the man. "Put it down," Boone ordered, his voice sharp. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering between the sheriff and Axel, who was still holding his partner down. With a slow, deliberate movement, he dropped the gun to the ground. "You don't understand," he said, his voice quiet now. "Slate will come for you, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants." The air was thick with tension, but Daniel stood firm. "I'm not backing down. You can take your threats and tell Slate I'll be ready." Boone gestured for the man to get up. "You're not getting off easy. You're going to jail." As the two men were cuffed and dragged to Boone's truck, Daniel turned to Axel, who was still standing tall, his gaze intense, as though watching every move the men made. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. Axel had saved them both. But as the sheriff drove the men away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. If these men were any indication, Slate's operation was far bigger, and far more dangerous, than he could have ever imagined. Back inside the house, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pictures of Connor Slate he had printed out. The pieces were slowly coming together, but he knew the worst was yet to come. With Axel by his side, there was no turning back. The night was eerily quiet as Daniel sat on his porch, his fingers drumming against the worn wood of his chair. Axel was by his side, his head resting on Daniel's knee, his eyes scanning the darkness. The sheriff had left with the two men, and although the immediate danger seemed to have passed, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the calm before the storm. He had learned enough about Connor Slate and his illegal operations to know that Slate wouldn't give up easily. He'd never been one to shy away from confrontation, and if there was one thing Daniel knew about the man, it was this: Slate had an army of men, resources, and connections. He would stop at nothing to get the puppies back. The next morning, Daniel was ready. Sheriff Boone had promised to back him up, but Daniel knew that the raid would be dangerous. The sheriff's office wasn't equipped to take on a criminal organization like Slate's. This was no ordinary drug bust or robbery. This was a covert operation, operating far beneath the radar, with resources that could rival any private military contractor. Daniel had been up for hours, his mind racing with plans. His hand instinctively rested on Axel's head as the dog lay beside him, and Daniel knew that together, they had a chance. Axel had been trained for this. And in a strange way, so had Daniel. They both knew the consequences of failure. Boone arrived shortly before noon, his truck rolling up the driveway. His face was hard, a grim line etched across his features. "You ready?" he asked, stepping out of the truck and scanning the area. "As ready as I'll ever be," Daniel replied, his voice low but determined. The two men stood by the truck as Boone handed Daniel a map of Connor Slate's compound. It was an old, abandoned facility just on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a rural area, surrounded by dense trees. The perfect place for a covert operation. "They've got guards at every corner, Daniel," Boone said, his finger tracing the map. "And they're armed. Slate's operation is bigger than we thought. He's got connections to more than just mercenaries, there's talk of military-grade equipment in there." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "That's why we're going in quiet. We need to hit them hard, fast, and clean. No mistakes." The plan was simple. They would approach from the east side of the compound, where there were fewer guards. Daniel and Boone would breach the perimeter first, with Axel providing a tactical advantage. If anyone tried to make a move, Axel would neutralize them, just as he had done before. As they drove toward the compound, the tension in the truck was palpable. Boone was a seasoned sheriff, but this was different. There were no rules here. No backup. Just two men, a war veteran, and a K-9, facing down an illegal operation that could change their lives forever. They arrived just before sunset. The compound loomed in the distance, its fences tall and intimidating, topped with barbed wire. The shadows from the trees stretched long across the barren ground, casting an ominous glow. It was the kind of place where people disappeared. Axel was the first to move, his ears perked as he sniffed the air, his nose twitching at the scent of danger. Daniel looked down at him, his voice a low whisper. "Stay sharp, Axel. We're almost there." The dog's response was immediate, a low growl as his body tensed. He was ready. The first guard appeared around the corner of a building, but he didn't see them. Daniel and Boone moved silently, closing the distance with expert precision. The moment the guard turned, Daniel and Boone were on him, their movements fluid and fast. Axel was a blur of motion, jumping forward to subdue the guard before he could even react. The guard went down in seconds, his weapon knocked from his hands. Daniel held up a hand. "One down. Let's keep moving." They quickly made their way to the entrance of the compound, moving from shadow to shadow, Axel leading the way. Daniel's heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The tension was almost unbearable. As they reached the main building, Boone motioned for Daniel to stop. He had spotted movement on the other side of the door, another guard. Daniel gestured for Axel to move ahead, and the dog did so with quiet precision, his body low to the ground, his eyes locked on the target. The guard had no chance. Axel lunged, knocking the man to the ground before he could even raise his gun. Within seconds, Axel had the man restrained, his teeth clamped around his arm, keeping him pinned. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady but forceful. "You're not getting out of here alive unless you tell me where Slade is." The guard's face twisted in pain and fear, but he didn't say a word. Daniel's eyes hardened. "Tell me now." Boone's hand hovered over his weapon, but he didn't speak. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the threat of violence. The guard finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Slade's in the back, through the main hallway. It's a bunker, military grade. You'll never make it past the security." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to make it past the security. I just need to get to him." The three of them moved toward the back of the building, Axel leading the way with Boone behind Daniel. The hallways were eerily silent, the only sound the soft pad of Axel's paws on the concrete floor. Suddenly, the loud crack of a gunshot rang out, and Daniel barely had time to react. The bullet grazed his shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor. Axel immediately leapt into action, barking fiercely as the guard who had fired ran toward them. Boone returned fire, hitting the guard in the chest, sending him crumpling to the ground. Daniel gritted his teeth against the pain in his shoulder. He was used to it, hadn't he spent years fighting for survival? He didn't have time for injuries now. They continued toward the back of the compound, where a massive steel door stood between them and their target. Daniel took a deep breath and nodded at Boone. "Let's finish this." They burst into the bunker, weapons raised, only to find Connor Slate standing at the far end, his cold eyes narrowing when he saw them. "I knew you would come for them," he said, his voice calm and menacing. "But you're too late." Before Daniel could react, Slate hit a button on his console, and the walls of the bunker began to shift. A hidden compartment opened, revealing crates filled with military-grade weapons. A high-stakes battle broke out, and Axel played a key role, subduing several of Slate's men with precision and speed. Daniel and Boone worked together, covering each other as they moved forward. The fight seemed endless, but they pushed through, driven by the knowledge that they couldn't let Slate escape with his operation intact. In the final moments, Daniel confronted Slate. The two men stared each other down, their breaths ragged from the fight. "You'll never win," Slate sneered. "There's too much at stake." Daniel's eyes hardened. "Not anymore." With one swift move, he disarmed Slate, and Boone cuffed him, the operation finally over. As the police arrived to take Slate into custody, Daniel felt a sense of relief wash over him. Axel stood by his side, his body still tense, but his eyes full of loyalty. They had done it. They had stopped Slate's operation, and the puppies would finally be safe. As Daniel walked out of the compound with Axel at his side, he glanced over at Sheriff Boone. "It's over," he said quietly. Boone nodded. "Yeah, but the road ahead won't be easy. You'll need to stay sharp." Daniel looked down at Axel, his loyal companion, and smiled. With him by my side? I'll be ready. The sun was beginning to set as Daniel sat on the steps of his porch, his arm in a sling from the bullet wound, but the pain was a distant thought compared to the relief that washed over him. The quiet hum of the night filled the air, the cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees in his yard. Axel was by his side, resting his head on Daniel's knee, the dog's gaze following every movement, as if keeping watch even in the silence. For the first time in days, Daniel felt something resembling peace. The raid had been a success. Slate was in custody, and his operation was over. The puppies were safe, and Axel, the dog who had been by his side through every moment of chaos, was now his companion for life. Sheriff Boone had called earlier, informing Daniel that the police had secured the compound and arrested the rest of Slate's men. The weapons and illegal K9 breeding equipment had been seized, and the authorities were beginning to dismantle the underground operation. Boone had also assured Daniel that the puppies would be placed in homes where they could live out their lives free of fear. But there was more to it than just a successful raid. For Daniel, the victory meant something different. It wasn't just about stopping a criminal, this was about redemption. Axel had saved him just as much as Daniel had saved Axel. Both of them had been damaged, broken by different experiences, yet together, they had found something stronger than either of them could have imagined alone. The next morning, as Daniel cleaned up the small house that had become his sanctuary, Axel trotted around the yard, exploring his territory. The dog had been through so much, yet there he was, always by Daniel's side, his loyalty unwavering. It wasn't just the bond of a handler and a working dog, it was something deeper, something that tied them together in ways neither of them could fully explain. Daniel paused in his cleaning to look at Axel, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You know, I didn't expect to end up with a dog like you. But I'm sure glad I did. Axel trotted over, sitting at Daniel's feet and looking up at him with a mix of pride and affection. His tail wagged once, a silent acknowledgement of their connection. Later that day, as Daniel sat in his truck heading toward the local animal shelter, his thoughts were filled with the future. He had been given a second chance at life, a life that had been darkened by the shadows of war and loss. Now, with Axel by his side, he had found something to fight for again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, there would still be moments of doubt, of fear, and of struggle, but Daniel knew he wasn't alone anymore. At the shelter, the puppies were being evaluated by a team of professionals, and Daniel had decided to help them find homes. They had been through enough, and now it was their time to heal. As Daniel stood with the shelter staff, he watched as Max and Bella were each paired with families who would love them. Axel, however, would never leave his side. They were partners in a way that went beyond their training, beyond the missions they had completed. Daniel and Axel were two souls bound by fate, by the challenges they had faced together. A week later, Daniel sat in the quiet of his home, Axel resting beside him on the floor. The house had been quiet for some time now, and Daniel was slowly starting to adjust to the peace. There were no more threats lurking in the shadows, no more enemies to face. The puppies were in safe homes, Slate was behind bars, and the operation had been exposed for what it was. But Daniel knew that the real victory wasn't in the raid, it was in the moments after. The moments when he could sit in silence with Axel, knowing that the two of them had healed each other in ways neither could have imagined. The bond between them was unspoken, built on trust, loyalty, and shared trauma. Axel had been Daniel's companion during the darkest days of his life, and now, Axel was more than a dog, he was family. As the weeks went by, Daniel and Axel settled into a new routine. Daniel began working with a local veterans group, helping others like himself who were struggling to find a sense of purpose after war. He used his experience with Axel to connect with others, showing them that healing came in many forms, not just through therapy or medication, but through the quiet companionship of a dog who understood the pain without ever needing words. One evening, after a long day of work, Daniel sat on the porch once more, Axel lying beside him. The sky was a deep shade of purple, the stars beginning to flicker in the distance. Daniel reached down, scratching Axel's ears gently. "You've been my best friend, buddy. And I'm gonna make sure I'm always here for you, just like you've been here for me." Axel looked up at him, his eyes soft but full of understanding, as if he knew the weight of those words. The story of Daniel and Axel wasn't just about a man rescuing a dog, it was about two broken souls finding each other and building something new together. It was about second chances, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and the voiceless souls who sometimes save them more than they realize. As they sat in the fading light of the day, Daniel realized that the journey they had been through, though filled with danger, violence, and loss, had brought them to a place of peace. Together, they had found healing in each other's company, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of calm that he had never thought possible. "Thanks for saving me," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with gratitude as he looked down at Axel. And as Axel lay beside him, his breathing steady and content, Daniel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. This story is a powerful tale of redemption, loyalty, and the healing bond between a war veteran and a K9 German Shepherd. It highlights the transformative power of companionship and the strength that comes from facing personal demons together. The journey of Daniel and Axel showcases how both human and animal can find peace and purpose through unconditional love and partnership. No one is beyond redemption, and no one should have to face their struggles alone. The story emphasizes the importance of companionship, understanding, and healing, showing that together, we can overcome the toughest challenges. Every creature, human or animal, deserves love, safety, and a chance to heal. If you were moved by this story, show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment, and sharing your thoughts and emotions with us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another meaningful story. Every interaction helps us continue bringing you content that inspires and uplifts. Your support is a huge motivation for us to create even more amazing stories. Thank you for being part of this journey. Once again, thank you for watching and being part of our community. Your presence means so much to us. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories. Wishing you all the best.